According to the Bank for International Statements, the D in DeFi is illusory. They say that decentralization is far from established in a booming multi-hundred billion dollar sector. I think it's close to 200 billion at this point in time. That the decentralization aspect of this is not quite all the way there yet. So we're going to look at BIS. This is sort of the central bank of central banks. They obviously have a horse in this race in terms of providing the backbone of the current financial system. So perhaps not surprising that they would take issue with DeFi. But that said, some of their complaints are indeed with merit, I think. If you look at DeFi governance, you tend to see that at present it concentrates in the hands of a few. So I'm going to toss this to Will for his take. Interesting to see, first of all, just BIS talking about DeFi to the level that it did, and interesting to see their findings as well. So what are your thoughts?
Totally. Yeah, I think they're spot on here. And I think anyone working in the DeFi industry would probably echo most of these concerns, maybe just like with a few critiques or nuances here and there. But I think you nailed one right there. The whole decentralized ecosystem needs some work and needs to take like a pause, like a little break check. I can think of multiple ways where DeFi is not decentralized. Just think of how you onboard into the ecosystem. Most people have to go get a Coinbase account, which requires KYC to get those tokens. Then you have to go put it into a DeFi app. That is one major hurdle they still have to overcome, and it could take a very long time. Governance, like you said, Zach, another big issue. A lot of these projects, they have some sort of treasury allocation for the app. How is that money split out to different participants? We saw a huge flame war erupt this weekend with SushiSwap, which is a DeFi exchange. And the core team who is building the application is asking for more money from the ecosystem. And right there, you already have some issues, right? There's a core team for a decentralized finance project. So how do you square those two things together? I think there are ways that you can kind of make those two work. Uniswap has been like a very good, I'd say, like brand around how you can have like a centralized team helping with a decentralized project. But for the most part, BIS is totally on spot right now. I think the D in DeFi more so stands for uncensorable. That DeFi should really it should be uncensorable finance, because once you launch an application, it's there, you can't touch it, it's going to stay online. A lot of these things are not very decentralized yet. And I think people are kind of thinking that DeFi stands for decentralized, but it's not quite there yet. Zach, I'll throw it back to you.
We'll take the Unfi rebrand to the next step at some point. Uncensorable finance. We'll see what Unfi can do. I think the thing that you're talking about there that's really important is this word "yet," right? I think at some point there may be a future in which these these protocols are indeed governed by a large swath of users. But right now, we're just not seeing that. If you go to the governance forums and you see how many people are participating in these votes that carry a lot of significance for big time money protocols, those numbers aren't huge. There's definitely a DeFi voter turnout issue that we see time and time again. So I think some of those issues are absolutely worth bringing up. Tossing this to you, Jen, curious for your thoughts on this report.
Yeah, I agree with you. You took kind of half of what I wanted to say. I think to achieve true decentralization, it takes time. And this report points to the different entry points for regulators. And unfortunately, if regulators come to the DeFi space too soon, it's just going to get out-regulated before we can achieve true decentralization. And this is what Commissioner Hester Peirce was trying to achieve with her safe harbor proposal. So it's feels so lopsided to me. I think a lot of these platforms need time to achieve decentralization. And I don't think they're going to get it if the regulators enter. But Naomi, I'll pass it up to you.
It's like an interesting situation, because if you look at what's being said here, they're grasping at straws from my perspective. Yeah, a lot of projects could go a lot further towards decentralization, but what they're calling illusory is they're saying, well, a lot of people hold a lot of governance tokens. They have a lot of say in this. Oh, there are some devs that have more power and are contributing more than others, and then they say this element of centralization can serve as the basis for recognizing DeFi platforms as legal entities similar to corporations. And they can then, register as limited liability companies, for example. I think that's such a backwards way of looking at all of this. And I want to go back to what Brian Quinten says, like months and months ago. He was the former CFTC commissioner, a very pro-crypto person. And he said, from my experience, fraud, like if we're talking about regulating these things, it's generally like consumer protection based. It's usually, how do we protect people? How do we stop fraud? All of this stuff. So Quinton said, from my experience, fraud usually involves a level of centralization and control as well as opacity. Query if those two conditions exist in true full DeFi systems. If not, how does the idea of investor protection change or shift from the government's to a participant's prerogative? And I guess my issue with all of this is that if you have these transparent things all on chain where you can actually see how decisions are being made, and people have, governance tokens which literally are just fed into these systems of change within the code itself. I don't understand what role like an LLC would even have in this. Why do we need one when all of that is on chain and completely transparent? You're not protecting people from fraud. They can see everything that's going on, and it's a completely voluntary thing. You get into these things, you understand exactly the mechanism that's going on because it is all transparent. Like, I think that the government here, now we're switching the narrative, we're switching the goalposts. It's no longer, well, we want to protect consumers, we're going to regulate these entities because they're opaque, so we're making sure they're doing things by the book by filing all these right reports. No, it's like all open. We don't need that mechanism. So now it's changing to be like, oh, well, this is fraud related, or, they can still be companies, or they're still kind of centralized. Like, it misses the whole point that we're taking the middleman out of the equation. We don't need the government to come in and regulate this stuff anymore. But Zach, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about, like, if you applied that on-chain standard across all decision-making bodies in the world, what would it even look like? Would it be just as centralized as we now are able to see from these blockchain data?